Well, welcome everybody. A very full house tonight, or this evening, for this discussion on this question around the enrichment of society. We have very distinguished guests with us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, that's hardly surprising. I am a very lowly professor here at IE University, go IE. I teach humanities here at IE University, and I've got to say that probably in the history of moderated panels, the gulf between the accomplishment of the speakers or the guests and the accomplishments of the moderator have probably never been wider. So I feel very humbled to be in the presence of the guests that we have invited here today to talk about this important topic. We have, to get to the point, to my right, Hannah Rothschild. She is of the famous Rothschild family, a name that speaks for itself. But beyond that, an accomplished novelist. I'm allowed to mention her book, which was published, was it 2 years ago, 2015?
That one, yeah.
The Improbability of Love by Bloomsbury, so you should go buy that. On top of that, she is a trustee of the National Gallery in London, a position she ascended to also about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And to my left, we have Kofi Appenteng, who's a Ghanaian lawyer, banker, diplomat, philanthropist, man of the world. He is the head of the Africa America Institute and was recently elected to be the chair of the board of trustees of the Ford Foundation. So it is not without it is not with hyperbole that I can say that we have sitting up here on this dais this evening two people who are at the center of two of the most significant institutions around the world, the National Gallery of London and the Ford Foundation in the United States. So we have the pleasure of having you join us. What our plan for this evening is we're going to talk a little bit up here. Hopefully I will not say almost anything after I've presented these remarks, so Hannah and Kofi can have the floor. And then maybe 15 minutes or so before we're due to end, we'll open up the floor to your questions, and we'll try and have a discussion then with you in the audience. So let me start by asking both of our guests to provide their own thoughts as to what they think our topic tonight, this notion of enriching society, means from their unusual and unique perspective. So we'll start with you, Hannah, if you don't mind. We can start with Kofi if you prefer.
I think we'll start with Kofi.
Okay, we'll start.
Then I can work out what I think about it.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? Yeah. No? You can. Okay. There's always one joker here, right? It's very good to see all of you. I'm obviously you're all here to see Hannah. So this question, I think it's a very broad one. Kind of what it means to me is that what's the philosophy one should have about how one wants to give back in some way, and I think that there are many pathways that one can go through, the kind of choices I've made have been to try to do it in two ways. One is to volunteer to serve on boards that are actually trying to do work on issues that I think are of importance. And the other is to work with people who have to make choices about what to fund and support. I found both perspectives to be very interesting. The dynamics between the two different types of institutions are also ones that have evolved quite significantly, I'd say, in the last 20 years.
That was so eloquent. Do I have to add to it?
I'm afraid so.
Okay, that's unfortunate. Thank you for your introduction, by the way. So I think enriching itself, I don't know how it translates from Spanish to English, but I think it sounds slightly problematic in English, but I think give back is a lovely way of phrasing it, and the importance of giving back. So I come at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm very lucky to be part of the Rothschild family, as was mentioned, and we have charitable foundations that were set up way, way back in the 19th century when we first made money. And it's part of the Jewish tradition, I'm from a Jewish family, where you have to give at least 10% of what you earn to charity. That seemed to be a very good thing to do. It's not only the Jewish people that do that, but it's one of the things that we adhere to. And it came about, I think, actually genuinely from a sense of gratitude in our case. You know, we'd come from a ghetto in Frankfurt. We'd made our lives in other cities in Europe, and I think felt profoundly grateful, my forebears did, and wanted to give back to society. And so it's kind of been passed down. It's a generational thing, and I sit on 3 different philanthropic foundations, which are family foundations. And then in another part of my life, as you said, I'm very interested in the arts, and I became a trustee of the National Gallery, and then I became the chair of the National Gallery about 2 years ago. And what's interesting, and perhaps something that we could talk about might be interesting, is the difference between the National Gallery is clearly a public institution. It's a kind of it's bound by the civil service and by civil service rules. I report to government, so that has a very, very specific set of criterion. Whereas on the family side, actually, it's pretty much governed still by the family. So that gives you more, gives you more flexibility. So. But I think for me personally, it's part of my DNA, which is being involved in charity and philanthropic works.
Kofi, could you quickly tell us what the Ford Foundation does in terms of its mandate, where it comes from, and its mandate and where it's going?
So the Ford Motor Company became a huge company in a very short period of time, and they decided to list the company on a public exchange. And then when they started talking to the lawyers, they realized that they would lose control of the company if they didn't do some planning because of the tax consequences of doing this. So they decided that a good portion of the shares they held would be held by a foundation. And then they went through some turmoil within the company. There was a leadership change. The founder passed on, and one of the grandsons took over. And he decided, this was Henry Ford II, he decided that he would gather some leading intellectuals to help him think about how to be thoughtful. And they decided, as the stock just kept on going up and up in value, they decided that they could actually be a global foundation. And they thought about what were the big questions of the day. And then they decided to have kind of some basic principles that would guide the work, but to have an independent board really decide what to do, and have a charter that meant that the intentions of the founder would be honored, but wouldn't be controlled. And so when Henry Ford II stepped down from the board of the Ford Foundation, he didn't ask anybody from the family to join, and it became completely independent. So we focus on kind of what's generally known as kind of social justice philanthropy. So we worry about issues around what's causing inequality in the world to increase, what are some of the root causes, and although we're a relatively large foundation in terms of our endowment, the amount of money is about $500 million that we give away a year. It's actually a very small amount when you look at all the different things you could do. So we really try to figure out how to be the risk capital in philanthropy, how to seed things that we think deserve more support, and that if they do prove to be things that are really, really helpful, others will come in. Other philanthropists, governments, etc., will come in, and so some of the most successful things they've done have become government programs. in the United States or in other countries.
What's an example of that?
The current president of the Ford Foundation was born to a single mother who had no money. She cleaned houses for a living, and most of his reading material came from the magazines that she picked up that were being thrown away. He got a grant to go to school, which was something that had been an idea at the Ford Foundation. They figured if they could show that education, early education, would pay big dividends, then they perhaps could persuade the U.S. government to do so. That's what happened. So there's been, billions of dollars invested in early education for people like Darren Walker, who's now the current president. So that's just one example. Microfinance. Grameen Bank's first grant was from the Ford Foundation, and it's now become something that in some parts of the world has been quite successful.
So it's not just contributing money, but contributing ideas then in terms of the way that these kinds of things
No, I think that, and this is a philosophical, I think, point that it's being debated within philanthropy. So the ideas are actually coming from other people. So you're supporting people who have great ideas, you think. If you try to be the one with all the ideas, then you probably are going to be working on the wrong things, is our view. That there's so much talent around the world, so many issues. People in different parts of the world are seeing problems in different ways. So we think our time is best spent really trying to understand what's happening out there. Where are the opportunities where some financial support, some plugging into networks we have can make a difference?
Hannah, do you want to say?
Yeah, I was interested in that because actually, of course, what we're seeing quite often is examples where philanthropists think that they can affect policy or they can create policy. So famously, we saw that the first of Mark Zuckerberg's attempts in New York to change the education policy in a certain area, and which didn't work. So I'm very, very interested by you thinking you're going to back individuals and back existing ideas, and that's the way to go. I think that's a fascinating distinction in policy making between Ford and what quite a lot of other people are doing.
Well, I think it's Ford's been around for a while now, so we occasionally we thought we were the smartest people and we had the idea. Yeah. And it ended up in disaster, right? So we started to realize that if we wanted to really make a difference. There's a famous incident in New York, just New York City schools, where a president of the Ford Foundation was persuaded that we really wanted to get involved in the policy issues in schools. And it ended up, turning out very badly for all of philanthropy, because then Congress started getting involved, and who are these people who think that they're smarter than us? So I think it's a privilege to be a philanthropy. You need permission from the society, right, in order to be able to do this work. So there has to be a negotiation and really understanding that people, rather than take the tax revenue into the government, they are letting you determine what to do with it. And I think there are good reasons to do some of that, which we can get into. But obviously you have to strike the right balance.
But can I just pick up on that, because I'm just interested within that. So you've got obviously a lot of, I mentioned Zuckerberg, which may be unfair. There are lots of different people.
We can pick on Mark Zuckerberg.
Well,
he's not here tonight,
I don't think, but he's not, he's a kind of very, it's an example, but you've got other people who are coming in and thinking that they can shape policy in some way. And And in fact, I've read somewhere, somebody said, that education, for example, is too crucial an issue to be left to the experts. With a lot of students here, they may not agree or disagree with that. But I wonder whether there has to be, at some point, not policing, because that's an unfortunate term, but whether you believe that there should be some framework that philanthropists and trusts should operate within, which stop any excesses of kind of personal enthusiasms? Or do you think that's the way it goes?
Well, if I could jump in just before, Kofi said at the beginning, he talked about this notion of the philanthropic choice, or making philanthropic choices, right? Which is a very interesting way of putting it. And then you talked about the difference that you see from your perspective between a public or a private position. So I wonder if maybe in some ways you can answer that a little bit, right? And so what are the differences between, say, for example, having a senior position of the stewardship of a major public trust like the National Gallery, which is obviously not just a national institution, but a central national institution, and a private foundation, which is obviously making philanthropic choices if you were outside of the public eye. Does that frame debates differently that you've seen? And do you yourself see that a sort of distinction in a way that might call for some sort of oversight or something?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I feel certainly with the National Gallery, I feel a huge weight of responsibility. I mean, the trustees own the pictures on behalf of the nation. Every single thing we do is scrutinised. So you have to make very, very sure that you make the right decision, because we ultimately carry the can if something goes wrong within the gallery, if we fall short of our budgets, if a painting's damaged, if there are reputational issues. Quite rightly, we're answerable to the government and then to the people of Great Britain, because this is an important national asset. It's a priceless national asset. And as you say, well over 6 million people a year come in. We do huge outreach, etc., etc. So I feel in that case that actually to follow due processes is quite important. Having said that, I mean, it costs £40 million a year to keep it open. And perhaps the most important part of my job is to keep the doors open, which means lots and lots of fundraising. So there is a kind of, you're slightly split in some ways. And whereas with the family foundations, we're not regulated, actually. We're regulated by tax laws, obviously, but we're not regulated in terms of what we do. And I happen to think that we're rather responsible as a family, and that we take great care.
Well, that's encouraging to hear.
Yeah, to interrogate our decisions. And in fact, to something you said earlier, I mean, we don't tend to go out and in England anyway, and try and set up entire new foundations or charitable things. What we try and do is find really good people who are following good practice to support them. But it is, you obviously do think, am I doing the right thing in these situations? And, are we trying to treat the root or the consequence? Are we trying to treat the cause or the effect? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, about how you make those decisions?
What do you make of that public-private divide? I mean, the Ford Foundation is a private foundation, but it's very much in the public. It comes out of a specific family that developed, that grew the fortune, but it moved it essentially into the public sphere, right? By moving it into independent stewardship and so on. So it straddles both worlds in a way, doesn't it? And does that, do you think, affect its mission and the way that people, the way that its mandate is seen?
Yeah, so there are a lot of issues floating around in that question.
Well, we only have 30 minutes, so you can run the timer.
So I think that one has to, it's a privilege to have a foundation. You have to get permission to do so. And then you have a charter that tells you what you can and can't do. There are public institutions which the government has decided that they're going to support, like the National Gallery, and they have to constantly justify themselves, right, to their sponsors and kind of leverage that support. I think that the way Ford tries to think about it is how can we? It's very flexible money. A government has trouble taking lots of risks because they're accountable. So if somebody says, oh, you spent, X dollars on something and it all got wasted. And so one of the reasons, I think, for private foundations is that they can take some chances that people think make a lot of sense to take. And if they don't work, it's okay, right? And when they do work, sometimes that inspires government to action because they say, well, now the case has been proven. We're not going to be in trouble with the taxpayers for deciding to support something. Foundations often will get involved in what has been the impact of certain government policies. The government is not necessarily organized in a way where they can do the independent research on what the impact is. And in some cases, it's appropriate for philanthropy to really be the ones to say, you're spending a lot of money on this, it's not really doing very much. You're spending a little money here and it's actually doing a lot, and that can be a real public good. So I think that when you recognize what it is, your role is in society as a private philanthropy, and you try to be faithful to that, which I think is what Hannah was talking about, being very thoughtful about it, then I think you'll see support for philanthropy grow. If you decide that you want to kind of steer things in a certain way, and the politics become unpopular, then you can have problems. But sometimes that's another role for a foundation. So in the 1960s, the Ford Foundation was very unpopular for supporting Martin Luther King. Today, people think that was a good idea, right? But at the time, many parts of the country, one of the reasons actually that the Ford Motor Company was very happy not to have any involvement in the foundation was, if you're supporting civil rights leaders at a time of real public debate, people might decide to boycott your dealerships and not buy your vehicles anymore. So they're able to say, look, we have nothing to do with them. That's, we did put the money in, but we don't control it. And I think that's what Henry Ford II, that's the reason I think he decided to leave it as independent.
But there's this question that Hannah brought, which I think is interesting, which is you're essentially saying that there maybe a potential danger, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but pursuing policy sort of in private, right, or outside of the public eye. So pursuing public policy, but doing so through private means. And a very good example of that would be the current U.S. Secretary of Education is a woman named Betsy DeVos, who comes from a wealthy family in Michigan. Her family made a fortune in a company called Amway. And they set up a philanthropic organization to pursue what are essentially ideological goals of the family. And what they're very committed to is the idea that public education is often suboptimal, and so therefore in a functioning civil society, parents ought to have the opportunity to send their children to private schools without at the same time having to support a failing public system. So you can take your money out of the public system and move it into the private system. And so they for years were pursuing through philanthropic activities the founding of many private schools across the US Midwest to pursue essentially what is really a very central public policy goal, which is what kind of... to me it seems that's the kind of thing I think that you're talking about, right? Which is the role of philanthropy in defining some of these policy debates and raising the question, do these belong essentially in a kind of a private sphere environment, or are they better sort of aired in a public sphere environment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of elements there perhaps to tease out. I mean, firstly is, I think more so in America than elsewhere, it's a way, I mean, you can set up a foundation and you can do it in such a way that you can avoid paying certain amounts of taxation. And arguably, that taxation should go to central government, and central government should make the decisions about what to use that on. So, for example, the building of roads, the building of public hospitals, and that is an argument. And I hate to keep talking about Mr. Zuckerberg, but for example, he said when they gave 99% of their shares of Facebook to a philanthropic foundation, he was very careful to say this is an LLP, limited liability.
Partnership.
LLC. Thank you, LLP. So in other words, he said, look, we are paying tax. We are giving away, we're paying tax. Now, whether that's sustainable is another issue. So there's that. And then I think you're talking about once you've set up your foundation, can you then operate in tandem with public services? And can you then start affecting policy?
Well, or can you enrich society if at the same time the mechanism for enrichment or improvement or whatever the word is we want to use essentially lies outside of the public sphere of public scrutiny?
I think
I'm assuming I can't walk into the Ford Foundation,
yes.
right?
I
mean, it's one thing for the Ford Foundation to support Martin Luther King, but what if the Ford Foundation decided, for example, to support, I don't know, the Sheriff's Association of Louisiana?
I think there's a much bigger point here, right? Which is that everybody has things they support and things they're against, right? And so the fact that one family has an agenda with their foundation, well, one of the things about philanthropy is it's tremendously diverse. For every one person you're reading about that you disagree with, there's 10 people doing other things. So if you want to say that people really shouldn't get into the policy sphere, I think there are a lot of unintended consequences there, right? Because you're saying, okay, well, Martin Luther King is okay. Well, that's with the hindsight of history. At the time, it was very controversial, right? And there were people who were supporting other agendas. So I think so long as there is a diversity of voices, right, it's not as if there is nobody. Even the Gates Foundation does not have enough money, right, to control policy, right? They can fund experiments in a few states, they can do partnerships with the federal government, but they have changed course based on whether it was working or not working. It was quite transparent. Everybody knew what they were doing. Every Ford Foundation grant, you can go to the website, you will see it listed there. The amount, the organization it's funding. So I think I think you have to have a bigger context for this, which is that if you make sure it's a rich, open, diverse set of philanthropic institutions that are at play, there may be real benefits to the public. And it's a small portion of the amount of money in circulation.
I totally agree with that. I think if we can zero in on a couple of examples, but actually, I think as a force for good, we can come up with hundreds and thousands more which are positive. I was thinking just actually as you were talking about the Texan family, Katherine Lorenz now runs it for her grandfather, George Matthews. Anyway, they made their money out of fracking. They made an absolute ton of... What was the family name? Can you remember?
There are a lot of Texans
who
made a lot of money in
But this particular family, so I think the foundation is worth, teens of billions. And it's now run by the granddaughter, who's an extremely forthright and interesting woman. And she's put all the money which has gone into which got come out of fracking into the environment. So you could say, these are interesting examples where money may not necessarily have come from something that everybody in the room agrees with, but it goes into something which probably most people would. And so I think that for every questionable decision, there are so many. And I'd like to go back to your point about catalyzing. I cannot stress enough how important that is. Again, at the National Gallery, our budgets are so stretched, they're so tight that we are counting paper clips, quite literally. And therefore, when we want to do something which is new or different, whether it's to acquire a new picture or to change policy or, for example, to explore a whole new area like digital, then we rely on philanthropists because our public budget doesn't begin to touch that. So the National Gallery was founded, in fact, by individuals' collections. It wasn't a royal collection. It's an unusual one. It came from the people. It's the people's collection, if you like. But everything we do is underlined and underscored and helped by individuals who help us to see round the corners, as I put it.
Yeah. I mean, to pick up on, yeah, so in a sense, right, one of the things that, in a sense, if you have a kind of a larger participation, then indeed, then what comes out of it reflects the sort of diverse participation to begin with. To come to your point, essentially what one might say is that if you have a diverse collection of, say, foundations or people who are looking for ways to deploy their resources following various ideas, it's essentially a way of trying to foster perhaps more innovation than you might otherwise see, right? As different people are trying to find out what might work for them. Is that essentially the argument that's there?
Yeah, so yes, philanthropy is not monolithic at all. There's just, so when you try to have a meeting of different types of foundations, I mean, the way they see the world is so different. They all find, some people are very focused locally, some people are focused on global issues, in the US, it's become a really diverse place where a lot of innovation is funded by philanthropies. That's the only place you can get that risk capital.
One of the sort of central tensions here, right, is that much philanthropy exists because moving individual wealth into a philanthropic or into a charitable foundation is, of course, a tax advantage vehicle. So a lot of the origins of much charitable giving or charitable foundations essentially are to claim the tax advantage that comes from that maneuver. I mean, one thinks of Bill Gates, for example, or Zuckerberg, as you're mentioning, or many others. The largest, do you know what the largest charitable foundation is in the world?
No.
It's not the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's the IKEA Stiftung in the Netherlands, which every year gives out, this is from The Economist a few years ago, but as I recall, like every year they gave out one award for designing a chair or something, and it was like 50,000 euros. And the size of their endowment is in the tens of billions of euros. And the reason it exists was it's a way to move money ultimately from the IKEA store into a charitable foundation and just leave it there, I presume, and hoping that eventually Sweden will change its tax laws and the like.
Well, they only give away one grant a year, 50,000.
They think that was, yeah, and when I last read it, they had to give one grant in order to qualify as a charitable foundation. So they had one interior design grant that they gave.
Well, I'm going to be going there after the session. I've got lots of things.
So the next time you go buy something at IKEA, right, your money ends up in this massive charitable foundation in the Netherlands. I'm only bringing that up to point out that, right, one of the things is that, you know, the source of it, the reason that matters is because if you think about it, what we're talking about is the way in which capital is flowing and then how that capital is used. Yeah. And one argument would be, well, the capital is better served by being captured by the government. The government then represents the public good. It distributes according to public good.
Look, I'm not an expert on historical tax laws by any means, but I don't actually think that Carnegie and Mellon and Ford and everyone else did it for tax reasons. I mean, I think in the case of Carnegie, for example, Andrew Carnegie, or in my forebears, it was nothing to do with tax. It was something that there did come a kind of social capital from it, in that they felt that they were doing good and they felt that rubbed off on them. So I'm not saying it was a completely, transaction-less decision, but I don't believe that in a lot of these old foundations or the older foundations it's about tax.
Right.
And I think the reason I mentioned Zuckerberg was because actually he said very specifically, I don't want this to be about tax. I'm paying tax on the money before I give it.
I guess my question was more that, in a sense, if you think about it as, you have a sum of capital that's going to be deployed in some way towards a public good. The argument would be, well, it could be deployed through government, which puts it into the public light, and therefore you have it's subject to democratic choices. Or it can be funneled essentially into private stewardship, and that private stewardship might itself be subject to public processes. But then would the argument essentially in favor of philanthropy is that, look, philanthropists can do things that government can't. They can fund experiments that governments won't. They can look for solutions that governments can't conceive of. In other words, there's a diversity of possibility, potential, and innovation that simply is not possible at the level of government.
I think going back to the catalyzing point, I mean, I thought that what you did in Detroit was a really interesting example, actually, of both private philanthropy working with public philanthropy and actually benefiting a section of society or a town, actually, in a really interesting way. I mean, would that be something you could tell us about?
This was, Detroit was going through some financial struggles. It's still struggling a little bit, but I think seems to be moving forward quite well. And there was some tough decisions being made with Detroit going through essentially a bankruptcy. And so the bankruptcy trustee approached the Ford Foundation to help to ask to get other foundations to team up together to do something that would reduce the losses that people with pensions, public pensions, would have, and also save a historic cultural institution. And so this was devised in a way that enabled this whole reorganization of Detroit's finances to occur. And this was a situation where government was either unable or unwilling to step in to do that piece of it. And so a collective effort of philanthropy was very effective. And so we recognize that there needs to be a lot more. So we're doing some things in terms of housing development, and so it's a long-term partnership that started with one transaction, and is now going to be probably a 20-year effort that Ford is a part of, but by no means the only.
Yeah. You said something very, I think, very interesting. You said, Rockefeller, Carnegie, these great philanthropists of people whose names are everywhere. And, they maybe didn't do it for tax reasons. They did essentially out of a sense of public duty, maybe. Yeah. You probably know that Warren Buffett signed this pledge that's been going around in the U.S. and maybe elsewhere, asking billionaires to commit, I think, the vast majority of their fortune, if I'm aware, to philanthropic causes. And it raises there's really two questions I think that come out. The first is that a lot of them, I don't know if it's just a business efficiency question or something, why go to the effort of setting up your own when you have a perfectly good one in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? And so you made the good point that there's never a way they're going to have enough money to be able to
That's exactly what Warren Buffett did.
But that's exactly right.
He gave his money to Bill and Melinda, yeah.
But I think the trend is, in fact, that I think a number of them have committed to giving it to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So what do you think about this idea of a kind of a super charity, a super philanthropic fund like that? Is that good, or would it be better to have it more diverse? And I have a second question, which is more provocative, but I'll stop there for the moment.
More provocative.
Then is that provocative? In other words, would it be better?
I think you ought to have the second part, because everyone's now just going to be thinking about what the provocative question is. Well, certainly I am. I'm more interested in that than what the first one is.
Well, I guess the question is that kind of aggregation of funds, is that, into it's sort of centralized philanthropy. Is that a good trend? It seems to be the way that we're moving to some degree.
I think we're going to learn a tremendous amount from this experiment, right? Yeah. So in modern times, I think this is the first time that I know of it at this scale. And so Warren Buffett and the Gateses have agree on a lot, and just decided to team up, and others are going to try to join in. And what I like about what the Gates Foundation is doing is you can find out what they're doing and how they're doing. They're very transparent about that. So they will tell you, this worked well, this didn't work well. And if you look at all the philanthropic capital there is, they're just a little piece of it. The headlines, because that's just the way the media works, more zeros, the bigger the headline. But there are lots of other efforts, so they're by no means, there's no kind of monopoly, right? So it's an experiment, and I think you probably have more problems trying to kind of interfere with these kinds of efforts rather than, just have rules that make it open for people to see what they're doing and what impact they're having. So I think they've got some very interesting things going on, and it's going to be a little while before we really know what how successful it's going to be, but I applaud the fact that they're trying to do things at scale in the ways that they genuinely believe will have a positive impact in the world, and time will tell.
Yeah.
I think to put this into context, if you look at what governments give away in terms of foreign aids or just foreign aid to other countries, I mean, it's in the billions, whereas even the Gates Foundation aren't giving away anything like that amount on an annual basis. So when you're talking about centralising, you could say that's the government. The government's collecting taxes. It's creating aid foundations of a type.
It's making involuntary philanthropists of us all.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, we're paying for kind of frontline important services, but we are also certainly in Great Britain. Yeah. We're certainly putting quite a lot of money into overseas aid and things like that, which aren't necessarily about being a British citizen. I mean, I think longer term, of course it is, because it makes the world a better place, and I'm wholly in favour of it. But again, just to put this into a context, I mean, what we're talking about in a way of these philanthropic foundations are quite a lot smaller than what governments are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's certainly true. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Although they have obviously different priorities, and they, I think we were talking about this a bit at lunch, that foreign aid distributed by governments often comes with agendas that are maybe secret or not so secret, whereas
maybe less transparent.
Maybe, Whereas the project of, for example, end malaria. That's central to, say, the Gates Foundation. It doesn't seem to be driven by any kind of an agenda, at least in that way.
That's right.
Okay, my follow-up that I know Hannah's waiting for.
Nervously.
I was going to ask you about your book. No.
I don't
and actually, maybe after this we can open up the floor to some questions. Yeah. I'm sure that people would like to ask you questions. So, no, it was simply this. I'm going to. I could choose Corbyn, but I'll choose Bernie Sanders. Because we have a lot of young people here today, and young people like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders started basically every stump speech that he gave during his unsuccessful run saying that one family in America, the Walton family, owns more wealth than 150 million Americans combined, right? And he did this by way of demonstrating the forms of extreme wealth inequality and wealth distribution that's taken place now across the West. In the US, particularly intense, but obviously wealth inequality in countries like Denmark and Germany, France, and so on is also very extreme. One of the arguments that people have put forward is that, and I think it speaks to a little bit to what Kofi was saying about the sort of the media value of gesture, as it were, that when you have, say, someone like Warren Buffett, who's worth a huge amount of money, or this billionaires club pledging to not keep the wealth that they've accumulated in private hands, but instead to move it toward philanthropic causes so that it serves, albeit maybe in some attenuated fashion, a public good. One of the arguments is, well, all this is doing is it's alleviating the kinds of tensions that wealth inequality actually creates. It's like, oh, it's not so bad that they have all this money, because look, they're giving it away to build houses for the poor and cure diseases and so on, and so therefore it's a good thing. And so one of the arguments is that philanthropy in some ways has a kind of a corrosive impact on the social discourse by essentially blurring the kinds of questions of larger social justice that, ironically, philanthropy itself often wants to address. Now, I should note that, as far as I'm aware, the Waltons have not pledged to give away any of their money, but, they have some foundations, but they're not doing like Warren Buffett. But many of the world's very wealthy have done so, and I wonder, given your vantage point, what you make of that argument and what you see generally about this sort of role between wealth extremes and the role of philanthropy as a way of reorganizing or redistributing the kinds of wealth accumulation patterns that we've found in our society.
Well, I think
Was that a good follow-up?
I think there are subtleties within the way you put that, which I'm not going to try and address.
Well, I was just channeling my Bernie Sanders, so
the corrosive element. I think I'm just going to leave that to one side.
I'm not saying that I'm just saying that's for the argument.
No. I mean, by the way, I think it's with privilege. You've got to be. There's got to be interrogation. I think there's no doubt about that. So, I mean, Bernie Sanders, in fact, came to Hay, and he blew us all apart. He came to Hay in Wales. If those of you who haven't been to Hay in Wales, for goodness sake, go. It's amazing. And he was there and very much did this thing about the problems between the very rich and the poor. And I think it's a very major problem, and I don't think it serves the rich, frankly, long term, to be that much wealthier than the very poor. I think that it's very, very important that we have more. There's more of a level playing field. I think it's one of the things that the Ford Foundation are doing. And if the way to achieve that is to encourage or even, take it more seriously than that, for the rich to put back in society, I'd be wholly in favour of that. My father, for example, is leaving most of his fortune to a foundation. I think that's exactly the right thing to do. I'm very proud of him for doing that. And so that'll be how his name is perpetuated, and hopefully his children and the other descendants will be able to honour what he wants to do with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that for everybody we need to think about a fairer society. I think that serves everybody at both ends. It's not just serving Bernie Sanders at all. I think it's really, really important that we do more.
Yeah, I don't, in a country like the United States, I don't think people care that someone has a lot of money. I think that the big issue has been the rate at which inequality has been rising, right? And philanthropy is not going to be an effective way to kind of redistribute that wealth. So societies have to think about what the rules of the game are going to be. Now, if you believe in, kind of relatively free markets, which is what the United States basically believes in, you're going to have people who win in a big way, especially with these tech fortunes, right? I don't think you want to say that that you're against that kind of success. But if you set up the rules where inequality just keeps on rising, then you do have, I think, a bit of a ticking time bomb. So I don't think it's there are, Ford is focusing all its philanthropy on trying to tackle the root causes of rising inequality. But, it's $500 million.
Yeah.
Right.
And the roots are deep.
Yeah. So, and we're hoping, others, are joining, right? There's a lot of people, we didn't invent it. Lots of other people have been talking about that. We just thought that was the best opportunity for us.
Yeah.
And but I don't think that philanthropy was ever designed to solve that issue.
Yeah. Yeah. I apologize for using the word corrosive. That was a bit
No,
I guess what I meant was simply that it's the kind of thing that you can point to and say, look, it's not so bad, because there's the sense of civil duty or civic duty, public duty. But the question is, where's the
Yeah, but I entirely agree with Kofi. I think I think there is a systemic problem, there, definitely is. I think the biggest problem we face.
Shall we open up the
West.
floor to some
great.
questions? So we have a few minutes left before we're done. So your questions now. So if anybody has a question, I'm not sure if we have a microphone, or if you just want to speak loudly. Yes, please.
I would like to ask you, because having a foundation is very important, but I think that everyone can give back. So what would you tell to the students? How could they give back, or how they compromise themselves, because they're very fortunate, for example, to be studying in this university. I think maybe we need to teach them that they have the compromise to give back to the society in a different way that you are giving.
I actually don't have a foundation. Right? I'm on the board of one.
He's only the chair of the board of trustees of the Ford Foundation.
So no, and I got involved in this as I thought that it would. There were very few Afro-descendant voices in boardrooms overall, and very few within philanthropy. And so through good fortune, I happened to be around at the right time, and I'm interested in this work because I think I spend my time with a greater diversity of people than different groups of people than many people who are on the board with me, and we found it helpful to have that kind of diversity on our board, and also with the African American Institute and the International Center for Transitional Justice. all of these organizations focus on parts of the world, and many of the people who founded it aren't really from there. So you need other voices in the room. So just my own personal reason for getting involved is that I think I can add some different perspectives, and it's a better use of my time trying to be part of thinking about how one works at an organizational level than it is doing local volunteer work. But I have friends who, for whom doing the local volunteer work is the best, it's what they love to do the most, and it's the best and highest use of their time. So I think all of us you need to find something that you find very rewarding, that you think is going to make a difference, and I think everybody should spend time on things other than, their own survival, if you're privileged enough that you have that space, right? So many people, 100% of their time is just coping, right? And so I've been lucky. I don't have great wealth, but I do have time, and that's how I want to spend it. So I think when I was a student, I was really trying to figure out how I could give back in some way, because that's just the tradition in my family and in my culture. It's like everybody has to, so everybody finds their own pathway.
I would agree that I think getting involved locally in whatever level is fantastic and incredibly rewarding. I think that for the students, though, the students have got something which is so important that we, with the greatest of respect, don't have, which is that you're at the kind of forefront of a new revolution in technology, and I think in how society is going to work. And I think you have not only the responsibility, but the foresight to be able to imagine what's going to happen in the future in a way that I can't. I am too old already. And it's really, really incumbent, I think, on the next generation to actually reinvent how we do so many of these things and how we help other people. It might be digitally, it might be just through using your feet, it might be using your brains, I don't know. But I think society is going to change very, very dramatically. And it's up to you, really, to help all of us, navigate that.
Absolutely.
So please help us.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
I'm very sorry to hear that you're having to count paper clips. Because if you would take modern, it would probably be what's the word? A portrait.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there a danger, do you think, that with the global crises, that philanthropic institutions and private money are asked to do the tasks that government should be responsible for? To give a small point, there's the Royal National Lifeboat Institute in Britain, which is totally funded by private donations. Is it possible that governments will expect institutions such as yours to do more and more, which they should be responsible for?
That's
I'm happy
a
to
very
answer
good
that.
question. For those in the back, if you didn't hear, the question was basically, is there a risk that private philanthropic funds will be increasingly necessary to essentially take over what we would consider public goods?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly good question, and it's certainly when talking with the other family foundations, we make a point of not stepping in where we feel that actually it should be a public thing. So we don't actually go in for hospitals, we don't go into education. It doesn't mean we don't have medical or educational strands to our philanthropy, but we believe very strongly that there should be a line, if you like. And that's partly because I think we can do more in those less well-funded fields, and partly I think because there is a line that should be respected, both by government needs to respect what their roles are, and we need to respect how close to that boundary we get. But yes, I think, and you're seeing that particularly, for example, in the museum sector, you're seeing museums relying more and more and more on foundations, on private foundations. I don't know what you're feeling about.
It's a very troubling trend, and I think it's cyclical. I think if you just look historically, this happens from time to time. But we think one of the reasons that inequality is rising is that there has been a failure to adequately invest in public goods. And that's a huge, huge problem. It's going to take a lot of young people getting involved, right, in order for that to change, because they have the most at stake, right? So, public education in New York City, for example, people of my generation benefited from really good public schools. Today, there are much fewer choices, and the cost of getting educated in New York City is sky high. I mean, it's more than that was for me going to college, right? So it's a huge issue, some foundations advocate around this, what is adequate investment in a public good like education, and it's one of those things that we have to really work hard to make sure becomes a priority.
We are sadly out of time. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our two panelists. Very interesting discussion tonight. Thank you so much for joining us here on stage. It was a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.